Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting. We're going to continue our unit today talking about ecology. Specifically, we're talking about cycles. These are things that you've probably heard about, like the water cycle, but we're also going to talk about the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, and these tend to be a little less well known about. So let's go ahead and hop into it and see what we're talking about today. So we're talking about matter cycling through the environment, okay? Matter is recycled through living organisms, the environment, and Earth's crust. Major biochemical cycles include the carbon, the nitrogen, and the water cycles. The carbon being used in your body or the water in your bottle could have been part of a dinosaur's lunch. When we die, our bodies become the grass and the antelope eat the grass, and so we are all connected in the great circle of life. That's a quote from a movie that you might recognize. Basically what's going on here is that these elements that have been on Earth have been here for a really, really long time, and that water that we're drinking today isn't new. It's been used over and over again by different organisms. And then when organisms use it, it moves back into the atmosphere and through the water cycle, and then it ends up in somebody else's water bottle. And so we're going to talk about some of these different cycles today. So let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so first of all, I wanted to talk about the carbon cycle. So carbon dioxide, which we can write as CO2, is taken up by photosynthetic organisms and used to make organic molecules such as glucose and other sugars. These organic molecules make their way through the food chain as consumers eat producers, and secondary and tertiary consumers eat those primary consumers. Geological processes such as the formation of sedimentary rocks and fossil fuels contribute to the carbon cycle over long time scales. Human activities such as burning fossil fuels and deforestation increase carbon in the atmosphere as well. So humans are a part of all of these different cycles, and the carbon cycle is a really good example of this because we've already talked about this in a little bit of detail. When you exhale, you're breathing out carbon dioxide, and so when you exhale, you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. When you eat plants and other types of carbs, those carbohydrates are made a lot of carbons, and so when you eat sugars and different carbohydrates, those carbon atoms get put back into your body. So we're kind of cycling through the carbons as well. When we exhale, we release carbon. When we eat certain foods, we bring that carbon into our bodies. And so we're definitely a part of these cycles as well. And the carbon cycle is just one example of that. Let's look at this other cycle. This is known as the nitrogen cycle, okay? So nitrogen is needed in all living organisms. Nitrogen atoms are found in all of proteins and DNA and RNA, and these are very important to our bodies. Nitrogen makes up the largest portion of Earth's atmosphere. 78% of Earth's atmosphere is nitrogen. So a lot of times people tend to think that the majority of our atmosphere is oxygen, but that's not true. Nitrogen actually makes up the largest portion of our atmosphere. Nitrogen in the atmosphere is in the form of N2. We call that diatomic nitrogen. Nitrogen is very reactive, so it doesn't tend to, you don't find it by itself a lot. It usually teams up with somebody else, and a lot of times it just bonds with itself. So we have two nitrogen atoms fused together, and that's called diatomic nitrogen. But this diatomic nitrogen is unusable by most life forms. So we have to take this nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and we have to fix it into ammonia, which is much more usable. Nitrogen can be fixed through lightning strikes, but also by bacteria living in the soil and root nodules. So although lightning strikes can fix a little bit of nitrogen in the atmosphere, it's not very consistent, and it's not the main way that we fix nitrogen. It's mostly this bacteria in the soil, and sometimes you can find them on the roots of plants as well. Although nitrogen is very abundant in the atmosphere, because fixing it is a difficult process, nitrogen is often a limiting factor in nature and plant growth. So a lot of times when people go out and buy fertilizer, they're really looking for the nitrogen content because that's something that's very hard to get in their soil naturally. But if they're going to go out and buy soil and fertilizer that makes their plants grow, they want to make sure it has a lot of nitrogen in it. If nitrogen is added to soils through fertilizers and then run off into streams, lakes, and rivers, a process known as eutrophication can occur. Eutrophication results in large algae blooms. So what happens here is, remember that nitrogen is usually pretty hard to find. If you have a lot of it in fertilizers and you're adding it to your plants and into the ground, if rain comes and then washes all that nitrogen into rivers and lakes, what you'll see is now that all that nitrogen's in the water, you're going to have an algae bloom. Okay, so the rivers and lakes don't normally have that much nitrogen, so now you're going to have a lot of plant growth happening, but that can actually be bad because this algae bloom sometimes will kill a lot of the fish in the lakes. So you have to be really careful when you're using nitrogen and adding it to the soil. You want to make sure it's not being run off into bodies of water and that you're not disturbing the ecosystem anyway. But nitrogen plays a really big role in plant growth, and it's also needed in all living organisms because of proteins and nitrogen being in DNA and RNA as well. So let's take a quick picture. Let's take a look at this picture of the nitrogen cycle. You can see one thing, they're called cycles because they're kind of like a circle, right? You can really start and end anywhere, and they cycle through, right? There's no start and end place here. But what I want you to look at is just the very top of that picture. You can see nitrogen in the atmosphere, and that's N2. The majority of our atmosphere is made up of nitrogen. It's over 70% is made up of nitrogen. And that nitrogen is very important. Plants want it, animals want it, but when it's in that form N2, it's just not very usable. So follow that arrow around to the left, and you'll see that it starts to go down into the ground. And there's these things called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. You can find those nitrogen-fixing bacteria on plants, on their roots, or in the soil. And what those bacteria will do is take this nitrogen and turn it into a form that's more usable by living organisms. Oftentimes it will be turned into ammonia, and once it's turned into ammonia, then plants can start to incorporate it and use it a little more easily. And so that's just part of the nitrogen cycle there. Again, the nitrogen cycle is very important because every living thing needs nitrogen in its body. And a big part of it is that we can't use it when it's in this form, so we have to fix it. And we fix it by using bacteria. Okay? Great, so let's take a look at the water cycle next. So the water cycle, this is something I'm sure you're very familiar with. This is something that people tend to talk about up through the grades, but even before they get to biology. But very quickly, I did want to cover it with you. So what's happening is this is the water cycle. The water that's been on the earth, the water that's on the earth today has been on the earth forever. So it's the same water that we've always had. So like I said earlier, the water in your bottle right now could have been part of a dinosaur's lunch. That's how long this water lasts for, is it's the same water that's been here this whole time. And it's cycling through, right? We're recycling it, we're using it over and over again. But basically what happens is when the sun will warm bodies of water, it'll turn from a liquid into a gas. And way over there on the far right, you can see that that transition is called evaporation. So water will evaporate into water vapor. It'll float into the atmosphere. It'll start to form clouds. It'll start to stick to dust, and that'll form clouds. Those clouds will eventually, when they move onto land and start to cool off, they'll start to get a little bit cooler. And when that happens, that water vapor will turn back into water, and it will precipitate down and as rain or snow or some other types of precipitation. And so we're using this water over and over again. One term that I really need us to know is right next to the term evaporation. It's a term called transpiration, and sometimes you'll see it called evapotranspiration. So we know that plants use a lot of water. If you're taking care of plants at your house, one of the main things you have to do to take care of them is just to make sure they have enough water. Well, what they do is they use that water to move minerals around their body, but eventually that water will evaporate off of that plant. And that term is called transpiration. So when a plant loses water to the atmosphere, it's called transpiration. Okay, that's a term that I need us to know. Okay, so thank y'all so much for being here today. Your teacher has some other work for you to do, so make sure to give that your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.